All right, so we could just start. So I feel like we should introduce ourselves.
Sure.
Would you like to start, sir?
Okay. Puzo, from Queens. From Queensville specifically. I run John Wang, social entrepreneurship, and that'll segue into John, which is where we started John Wang at Queens Night Market.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, that's a good intro, I guess, right?
Yeah, that's perfect. And my name is Rana, also from Queens. I'm a community organizer and I run a women's nonprofit that trains women in self-defense. And today we're here with John Wang, who is the founder of the Queens Night Market. We're super excited to learn more about your story. Do you want to quickly introduce yourself?
Sure. As you said, John Wang, and I run the Queens Night Market.
Nice. Okay, so we want to hear really about like the origin story. And we know that there's a ton of stuff out there on you already. Mm-hmm. So we want the the real nitty gritty. Tell us the truth.
No, it was a long process, and I mean, probably a lot of this is repetitive of what's out there. But I went to law school, business school, racked up tons and tons of student loans. Sort of felt like I had to bite the bullet to pay those off. So I went to a big corporate law firm, good corporate law firm, I guess. In New York City, was doing mergers and acquisitions for about 4 years, managed to pay off the loans, pumped every single penny into the student loans, paid that off, saved up enough to do something super wild and risky for a year, whatever that was. And when I left the law firm, I hadn't decided what that was. So I dabbled in a bunch of other projects. Most of them did not come to fruition. Or I guess none of them come to fruition. And
it's like the story of the entrepreneur.
Yeah, well, I think most of it was I didn't have any special skills, right? So like if you're an engineer, you have these sort of skills that are easily marketable, but you also probably leads you in specific directions. But, as a sort of generalist, I went to law school, business school, didn't have any sort of real career behind me. So it wasn't sort of floating around thinking about entrepreneurship. But a lot of those projects ended up being teamed up with people who did have special skills, right? So whether it's a programmer, a coder, or a restaurateur or something like that, and it turns out like it's not easy to work with partners, right? Especially one that you know personally or friends, and so a lot of those we like dreamt big, stayed up all night, had like many bottles of wine and weeks of wine, and came up with these great ideas, and then someone got cold feet, or just couldn't come through, or someone got really scared, risk. So anyways, went through a lot of these projects, but also traveling around a bit. And then at that point, I'd been in New York, like officially something like 4 or 5 years, and unofficially since I spent most of my grad school time here. Unofficially like 9 years or 10 years. Nice. But I was tired, New York is a grind, and I was like, okay, well, I'll give myself 2 more weeks to think about something to do in New York City. If I don't, I'm going to move to New Orleans, which I love New Orleans.
Yeah, I love New Orleans.
So it's like, telling my friend from business school, he's an Italian, like old school Italian, really fun, loves Italy, loves telling you about Italy. And he was sort of between jobs, and I was trying to convince him to do a big Italian import-export expo, like try to make the U.S.'s biggest Italian expo. He was super excited about the idea. He loves chatting people up, but then he sort of got cold feet again. He was like, oh, that's a great idea, but I think it's a little bit too risky for me. So I remember the next day, I woke up the next day, said, holy shit, sorry, pardon the French. I said, wow, how cool would it be to have a night market in New York City?
Yes.
There was one, at the time, I think there was only one. There's one in LA called the 626 night, but that's like, I think it started off as 1 weekend a year maybe or something like that, but it's a few weekends a year. It's not like it's consistent. And then Vancouver had the two biggest night markets in North America. And that was it. I think maybe a few things like here and there called themselves night markets around, but it wasn't to the scale. And so I tried to figure out why that was. And I spent, a few weeks basically just Google searching night markets in the U.S. and New York. And like it had been brought up by a few people here and there, like small snippets of quotes from maybe like a comptroller in New York or, some councilman, like, oh, wouldn't it be cool? And I think, maybe Bourdain at the time had said something.
Yeah,
but anyway, but it was I was like, well, that has potential to be has a lot of potential in New York City.
Right.
Could be really impactful, socially. So I was like, okay, well, I'll spend a year doing that, fully expecting to fail, because it's New York, and yeah. And so from there, it went from just like the next steps are kind of a blur. I ran out of server space on my server, so I had to go through and delete emails.
Oh my god, that's how many emails you sent out.
Well, so then I had to go through and see the things I'd been sending in 2015.
That's incredible.
Hey, my name is John. You don't know me. I don't know you. Like, what about night market? And it's so just tens of thousands of cold emails. And just anyone, every politician, every elected official, every park, so just scour. Like literally, I spent a week, I think, scouring every square foot from Google Earth on New York City, figuring out
where would it happen,
where could it happen, and then from there that was so. It was basically almost exactly a year in planning between the day I woke up and said I'll spend a year doing it to the day we launched.
So I was just gonna ask, for folks who've never been to a night market, like you said, there are no other night markets in New York City. Can you walk us through the vibe?
Well, now
what
there
is
are
that?
a couple. There are a couple copycats now.
Okay. Everyone's trying to be you.
Yeah. So it's a little bit different. So most of the night markets, I'm most familiar with the ones in Asia, and they sort of take over the city streets and sort of, I think historically, legend, rumor, or maybe it's completely accurate, but it was often too hot in the day to do your shopping, and so all the sort of pedestrian activity would happen at night when it cooled down and people would go outside and spend time. It's sort of cool. So you have feels like the entire city's out together in a sort of communal experience. It's usually super cheap, at least by sort of U.S. standards, right? Tourist standards. It's just a bunch of bustling activity. It's there's stuff for kids, there's stuff for adults. It's really electric, and it sort of is integrated into the city. And that's sort of, you might ask about it later, but one day, if the Queens Night Market or a New York City Night Market still exists in 2 years or 5 years or 10 years, hopefully it sort of starts one day, gets sort of integrated into the fabric of the city instead of being a sort of destination one time a night thing. Obviously there's huge challenges in New York City to do it, and most of the night markets I think probably originated hundreds if not thousands of years ago, so it's not they had a plan around, or maybe it was already there when they were doing city planning. This kind of thing would be trying to figure out a way to make it work. So those are long-term ambitions, and I'll probably be dead long before that ever actually happens. But,
you never know.
Right. So yeah, and so the idea was to replicate it here, but in a way that had a social mission, which was I think I've condensed our mission statement down to can you be New York City's most affordable and diverse community event. It comes with a lot of decisions tiny decisions that affect that along the way.
Right.
But sort of the elevator pitch would basically be that.
That's awesome.
How did you know the first few who the first few vendors were? How did you know who to approach?
That was crazy.
Yes, tell us.
That was
crazy.
So I had this idea, back then, I guess it still is a little bit, but back then crowdfunding was a big thing, and it was sort of all the rage, but not necessarily to raise the money. If you did, that'd be great. But there are a lot of articles and journalists focused on what are the cool ideas coming up, and both creatively but also business wise. And I thought, well, probably unlikely that I'll raise I think it was $100,000 we were trying to raise for the first Kickstarter campaign. But people will pay attention. If you don't have a video or some sort of tangible thing that journalists can at least click on or read, then they're just going on faith. And so once you put yourself out there in front of the world, people believe you a little more. It's a little more tangible. So my wife Storm had future wife, now wife, back then, just friends back then. She made a Kickstarter video.
Nice.
Then we actually didn't speak for a few years. Then we got married.
Was it that bad of a video?
No.
That is the reason I joined out.
So that came out I think in January, and then immediately I think DNA, which defunct or old DNA, rest in peace. Katie Honan was hey, it's really cool. Queen, I cover Queens. They would love to do it. And then it just sort of started trickling up, So then it got in, other reporters saw that, and then it got in Gothamist, and then it got in Metro, and then eventually our opening night was covered by New York Times. And but but the difference between what I had pitched and what it was initially is it was night and day. I think the first night we had something 25 food vendors and 25 merchandise vendors, and I was so nervous the day before we opened. I think, oh my god, maybe we call this a soft opening. I don't know how many people are going to show up. I'd be happy if 500,000 people show up, and tens of thousands of people showed up.
Wow.
And so the first vendors we got were just had whoever. Oh, I think we got a lot of articles in like Asian themed press, Asian language press, and so people who read those and really entrepreneurial would write, and so that happened, and then the next night when I got home, that was April something 2015. I got home the next day at like 3 p.m. from like cleaning up. It was like a mess. So I was there for something like almost 36 hours. Yeah. And then I got home and opened my email, and I had lots of angry emails from the local community, but I also had something like overnight, something like 100 something applications just for people that had come that very first night. Like, oh, I want to do this now. So then it became like the first set of vendors that very first night was really, really hard to like get and convince. But once, the tricky thing about vendors too is I've never converted a vendor. Like I've never called a restaurant or gone to a restaurant and just told them about the concept and they went. Like it always has to be either someone convinces them to do it or they actually go. Mm-hmm. So as much as I would like to say I'm good at recruiting, I'm really it's so hard. And it's not as I said, I probably converted one or two out of about 400 vendors that have come to the night market, and it's so it's really just when people their friends tell them to do it or they go otherwise.
So it sounds like a lot of your entrepreneurial kind of like the beginning of your entrepreneurial journey was just like putting yourself out there and like kind of taking that leap of faith, and people bought into that.
Yeah, no, I think I was also a bit lucky because I had sort of psychologically said that I'll spend a year doing it, and caution to the wind. Like I was like, okay, fine. If it fails, it's fine. I'll like put my head in the sand and run off to New Orleans and like never have to see New York City again.
Much warmer.
Yeah, well, too warm. I try not to go to New Orleans in the summer and never go in summer because it's unbearable. But so a lot of it was, but also I was telling someone the other day that I think it was a little bit of a blessing not to have like entrepreneurial experience in like event planning, because so back to the story about like partners. I decided to do this because I thought, well, you don't necessarily need special skills and like technical skills to do this. Like if you sort of have some common sense and know how to talk to people and convince people of your story and like the idea that you could probably get it done. But that came with a lot of sort of unexpected blessings in terms of like how do you charge vendors and how do you relate to vendors and how So I think we have, independent of our sort of social impact on New York City, I think vendors love the Queens Night Market, right? Like there's things that we do that no other event plan, and maybe for good reason,
like
right? How you relate to them. You don't I don't put vendors in positions. I try not to put vendors in positions where they have a chance of losing money, right? So in a lot of our events, we will not charge them the first few times they do it, just to make sure that it's worthwhile. Because I don't, I didn't do this to like profit. I don't profit off vendor fees, so that's important to me. Like, and if I got into a business to like burn a lot of bridges with a lot of people that are like have a hard time, these vendors operate on very thin margins, and sometimes sort of a rainy day on a Saturday will not put food on their table, for the week. So trying to like balance what you can for them is tricky, but it's something that like because I wasn't in it to make a bunch of money and rip off a bunch of vendors, it's easier for me to say like, okay, well, when I've been probably approached every week by a big major event, says, hey, do you want to partner? Let's make a lot of money on the food. And I'm like, yeah, well, if you're charging vendors more than 15-20%, and it goes bad, they're in a pretty tough situation. So I usually just turn down partnering on most events that I can't sort of control and or like have supreme confidence that it's going to be worthwhile for vendors.
That's amazing. I mean, I have chills just listening to that, because I feel like right now in New York, there's so many small businesses that are being kind of put out because of spikes and hikes in their leases. There's just recently in Astoria, like a couple of stores that just have been there for a really long time and just been put out of business. And so hearing about this, like really putting the small business owner first, the vendors first, is something that's so refreshing within our current context. Yeah,
I mean, so there's some of the personal motivation was like when I was a lawyer, I was making probably too much money, more money than I should. Then after I quit, I was not making any money, and like living in New York City is tough when you're like just in general. So even if you were making like big time lawyer salary, it's tough. And so I always felt, I know it sounds terrible, and I always feel guilty, but like when you travel to like developing world from the U.S., like you go to these food, you eat at the best restaurant in the city for seems like pennies on the dollar here, and so you sort of get to eat anything you want, you get to experiment, you get to try everything, and you always sort of feel like royalty, so to speak. And then you come back to New York City and it's like, oh my God, like that buys me a French fry, you know? And so and so I thought, you know, if I'm going to live in New York City, like, can you create a space that like everyone can sort of feel comfortable at? And so that's a big driver. I mean, so these are all related, as I was trying to explain, like they're all, these small decisions are all sort of related to like, can you create this ultimate end goal of, you know, sort of equitable, affordable, diverse space. And there's these small decisions you have to make along the way. A lot have to do with the vendors, right? Like if you don't have diverse vendors and they can't make, I mean, most of them make incredibly small margins with our price cap. We understand that. And so, you know, we may try to subsidize, like we don't make $1 on vendor fees. And so I don't know. So a lot of it was just sort of, you know, reaction to New York City, sort of incredibly high, unsustainable,
it's hard
standard of living, price, cost.
Yeah, no, as I like bouncing off what you said for sure, like being comfortable going into like as a vendor, I was comfortable with the situation and it felt like I wasn't going to be drowning, and that's why we started what we did. And like you know, like you started Queens Network, we also started with the sense of naivete, and it's like, all right, let's see what happens. Maybe we might fail, but you know, it's not gonna make us bankrupt. You know, and we know that we're gonna be taken care of in that matter. And so, yeah, no, you definitely set that sort of like feeling.
Yeah,
for sure.
But it's tricky because it's also had this potentially trickle down effect. Maybe it's good that, you know, other events, when they sort of try to poach my vendors, which is fine, like the vendors can do whatever, they should do whatever makes them the most money, it's totally fine. But they often sort of like, well, John does it this way. And then I'm like, oh, then you know, maybe I'm ruining it for other.
But you're setting the standard.
But it may not be good, right? Like, so I mean, it's true that I did it my way, and it's because I didn't grow up as an event planner, and nor did I ever expect to be plan a single event in my life. But I also don't have the same sort of financial, I mean, maybe I should, and maybe I would love to make a lot more money off this, but, you know, the motivation going into it was not to like, you know, having the expectation that, you know, I'll probably sink a bunch of money in this for a year and probably move on to New Orleans, you know. So now, like, I'm also stuck not only with like my own business model in some ways, but also just sort of having the incentive, having gone into it was not about, you know, milking every dollar and kind of, you know, taking a cut of everyone else's cuts. And so, yeah.
So tell us more about that balance, right? Because it seems like the conversation around development in the city oftentimes does have this trade-off of like, we need to have growth and we need to make things financially sustainable, oftentimes at the expense of small business owners, which you very intentionally made the decision that you're going to center small business owners. So tell us about how you've been able to make that sustainable.
It remains to be seen whether it's sustainable. I mean, it's pretty.
You're doing it.
It's true. I mean,
your hope. We need the hope.
No, I mean, it's the other thing about the night market and specifically our vendors is I think we're the only event where a significant portion of the vendors that come, one are sort of have 9-to-5 jobs. Like, I think like 90% of them have like food jobs outside or jobs outside the food industry. And most of their motivation is not to make money, right? Okay. There are a few, and I know very well which ones. Will email me if they don't make.
I wish.
His goal is to make money.
I'm exactly the same.
Too much social, not enough entrepreneur.
But so. Meaning, like, where do they go from their vendor, right? So there are definitely vendors, significant number have gone off to start restaurants. You know, some of them listed, you know, number one New York Times for this or that, and have, you know, been written up in stars and here and there. And so that's probably great for them. Some of our vendors treat it as like a, you know, Saturday income, extra income to like, you know, help send their kids to school and, you know, and then other ones are testing it out. So, you know, it's not, officially, I think we've launched something like 300 businesses in New York City.
That's
so like
incredible.
That sort of who filed for their business paperwork and started the night market, there's like something like 300. I'm sure a lot of them don't exist anymore. Sort of they let they dissolve the company, but you know, getting them to test. And I think the thing about the night market, it makes, as Mafuzo was saying, is it sort of lowers the barrier to entry, right? Like even getting the permits in New York City is like, assuming you don't file for like, you know, an LLC, which costs a few $1,000s, which is annoying. Like, and I know a lot of people think it's annoying, but if you just sort of like, if you're able to stomach the risk and start a sole proprietorship or something like that, right? You can do it for, pretty cheap. The health department permits all told cost maybe $100. I think it's like 25 or something for the food permit, and then the $70 for the actual license, and then you're ready to go, right? Which is pretty wild. And I think the initial investment in the night market, I think, assuming the minimum commitments, like this is for food specifically, but assuming the minimum commitment is like 5 nights, that's usually under $200. And so people are in the door, having started a business, vending the first night at the night market for, around $1,000, which is, sure, if you lose $1,000, that sucks, but better than
relative
to like getting
opening a spot, getting a truck.
And I mean, and despite the fact that I sort of play down the margins, which they are very low at the night market in terms for vendors, but there are vendors who make a lot of money at the night market. They're so popular, and those are always good stories too.
Nice.
So yeah, I don't know. I want to speak. It's tricky for me. The thing about the night market is very personal. Also, it's something like I wanted to do.
Right.
So I don't think I pretend that it has any broader connotation of sort of like business development in New York City or small business, because it's also like, it's pretty far removed. It's in the middle of a park that you have to travel to get to. So it's not like it's as I said, integrated into like a financial center or like a neighborhood. It's it is at
my
the
neighborhood.
Moment. It's not quite. I mean, it's still treated as, I think, a destination. Which as I said, if one day the Queens night market becomes a sort of like integrated thing into the city, that's not just Saturdays, but Monday through 7 days a week, and it's supporting sort of more regular business hours for these vendors, then maybe I may have more thoughts about the broader impact on small businesses.
So on that, right, what is that vision and what needs to happen? So talk a little bit more, because there are some barriers to entry, which you mentioned. So can you talk more about that, and then what needs to happen for that integrated night market to exist?
Oh man, yeah.
I know it's a lot.
I sometimes sort of daydream about it, but it's hard to imagine, because you can imagine, them putting up a structure for it, right? Which is fine. Then it's sort of like Bourdain Hall probably would have been something similar, where he put hundreds of millions, or they had allocated hundreds of millions of dollars to build this thing that's sort of like super cool, hip, international food thing. But then it's a food hall, and I think most of it is about the sort of flow of a city. So to put something in a building, I think you could probably do, and you could probably call it a night market, and that'd be great. But it just doesn't have the same effect, and the sort of electricity and the feeling of the city mingling together, which is always the thing I sort of gravitate to. Kids sort of running around playing the next game, while their parents are eating, and talking to the person next to them who they've never met before, maybe in a completely different social circle and maybe even socioeconomic class, but they're sort of both having a great time because they're part of this thing. So in terms of so in essence, I think I'm saying you would have to take over city streets, which the kind of permitting process is crazy, and who knows what that would look like. There's all sorts of regulations around it, but I think it would take a governor or mayor be like, hey, I want a night market in the city, and I want to designate XYZ as pedestrian areas during these hours and that kind of thing. But then there's all sorts of crazy other things. We've been at Rockefeller Center. We were there last year, as Mafusa was, and we got so lucky because the people there were like, we will give you sort of the street parking, which is New York City. If you had, having an event in New York City, where do you find parking for vendors? And that's always just huge tricky. And another reason, I rarely ever consider events in Manhattan, because that's just another thing that most organizers fend for yourself, go find parking, go pay $100 at that garage if you want to be here. And just is not something I want to I try not to hide any of the costs from vendors, and I try to consider if I were going to sell whatever I was going to sell on a Saturday for fun or for whatever, how hard would it be? And I just I had a car in New York City for a full 2 weeks or something, and I was I couldn't do it. Maybe it was 3 weeks. Maybe it was 3 weeks, but I remember the day before I sold it, it was I think I spent 3 hours trying to park in my neighborhood. I was sorry. So those are those kinds of things I try to consider. And so just going back to how could you take over part of New York City or integrate part of New York City, and vendors are obviously coming in with their cars or need to come in with their cars, and that's just its own nightmare, especially if you're already blocking off the street just for pedestrians and stuff. So anyway, those are things that
that's a big deal. I remember when we'll do events, one of the first questions we'll ask, do you have parking? Because you have to bring your supplies. So much of it is logistics. It's so many moving parts, and it becomes overwhelming.
Oh, yeah,
It does
yeah.
become overwhelming at
Yeah.
points.
I mean, it's funny because people always say, it must be so hard setting up the night market every week, which I'm sure it is. It's very long hours, but also like each of these individual vendors are essentially creating their own night market. They've got stuffing these things in their cars, and whether they're renting cars or assuming they're using a commercial kitchen, getting those hours, ordering supplies, and especially the ones that work Monday through Friday. The other things I remember. So my wife was doing the stories for the book that's coming out in a few months. She so I sometimes listen in on the stories, or she'd tell me the stories, and so she they work Monday through Friday. After they get off work at 6 p.m. on Friday, they go straight to the bulk purchase food store, and then they start cooking, and then they're done at like 5 in the morning. They take a nap, and then they go to start packing their car to go to night market, and that's a lot of work. And so it's as much as people say oh, the night market must be a nightmare to set up every Saturday, but these vendors are doing it Friday, Saturday, Sunday, just because it's pretty intense, and so which is pretty amazing, and that they still do it. And also still amazing that my most rewarding part is not dealing with the vendors that want to make money and make tons and tons of money. It's the ones that just love being there, and so the cool thing is you'll see under these tents people bring their families, and they're having fun, and they may sell I'm sure it's easier to have fun if you make a few dollars, but there are nights that people just hang out with their friends. It's raining, for instance, and they're just playing cards with their family under there, and it's a sort of bonding experience. And those are the ones that make it special. I think there's a joy at the night market that is partly just feeds off of the vendors' joy there, because I know there are all these events where vendors are just trying to upsell you and get you to buy their stuff, and it seems like it's super transactional, which sucks, or whatever. There's a place for that, but the night market I feel is less. It's sort of it really does feel to me like a community space.
Yeah, especially definitely amongst the vendors. Just we're just constantly just when you have that downtime, you'll talk to them, you'll get some advice. You'll how's the rest of your week looking? What do you what are your talk about our day jobs? Talk about our families. Oh, you're back. I haven't seen you forever.
It's super cool. And then I know that there are dinner clubs within our vendors now, which is pretty cool. So a lot of them are going to each other's house. So that's pretty cool too. Yeah.
So your vision for building that community is happening.
I mean, that was sort of natural. I think I didn't. I mean, to be completely honest, it's not like I had a vision of what makes vendor networks good, right? It was just sort of I think it just feeds off of, can you treat them well, and or maybe not even well. There are nights that vendors lose money, and that sucks, and there are events that I do that I'm sure vendors have lost money, but in general, if you can sort of, but it's also in contrast to the other events, right? So often these other events, vendors feel like competitors, and and I think it comes from the organizer and the way that they talk to the vendors, and sort of just the whole dynamic of interpersonal dynamics sort of start pushing an event to feel one way or another. So I think just vendors being happy. We don't, we generally try. I personally try to dissuade vendors who are trying to maximize every dollar they can make in the night market. And I usually tell them it's not for them, right? And I think I was reading some feedback recently last year and sent out an open letter to vendors, sort of telling them this is not the place to make money, nor to become rich, and nor should you expect to, and nor do we necessarily want you here if your goal is just to be rich. And so I think that the self-selection process itself helps weeds out certain types of vendors, and all of a sudden the ones that are there are happy to be there, and they're great when they make money, and they're okay when they don't. So I think anyway.
I think we probably have time for maybe 2 more questions.
Sure.
And I was wondering if you could touch a little bit about Queens, right? Why is it so special that this market is in Queens out of all the other boroughs in New York? Why not New Orleans or?
So when I was looking back in 2014, when I sort of woke up that day, I was researching night markets, and anyone that was in New York City, anyone that was in the U.S. or North America, or had just popped up once or something, generally were Asian themed. And to me, that was just not interesting. Not because they're not cool, but just because I was if I'm staying in New York City, I want to do something that's specifically tailored to New York City, benefits from being in New York City, which is obviously the diversity, right? And so the point was which is why I'm a little reluctant when I think back to the very first night of the night market, which was why I brought up the Chinese language newspapers or Asian language newspapers, because the first night it was not especially diverse. I think we had lots of Asian representation, lots of Latin representation, and that was sort of, I think, pretty much it, which was a little bit of a shot in my stomach. The next week was much better, but So New York City itself was just for the diversity and like, can you actually prove that you can have an affordable place in New York City? And so those are the things that were specific to New York City. And then Queens itself was, as I said, I poured over every inch of New York City on Google Earth for a week or two. And then, so it came down to a few spots. Like, I mean, there's not that much like flat service in New York City that's just, there that can be it's accessible. And so it was sort of down to like, one place in Brooklyn maybe, and I think maybe Central Park, which would never happen.
Dreams can come true.
And then the Flushing Meadows, and the more I looked at Flushing Meadows, there's obviously everyone recognizes the World's Fair, but there was also just like at the time there was all this stuff coming out about the most linguistically diverse place in the world, and like I know there are a couple of cities or villages that sort of tout being the most diverse place in the world, and Queens among them. I think like Toronto also says it, and I think there's some like village somewhere in, like, I think there's a village in like Middle East or in Africa, or there's just like some really tiny thing that like however it's defined is the most, so I don't know, but Queens is always within like 1, 2, or 3 of being named most diverse place. So it made so much sense, and I think Queens sort of embraced the idea, like let's really showcase our diversity, let's showcase our neighborhoods, and let's do these things. And Queens was kind of also at the time, like I know there's all sorts of like TV shows now about Queens.
Cool.
But 5 years ago, not that like I'm a huge historian of Queens, but felt like there was this, like it was on the cusp. It was still sort of underdog status, but it was a lot of people were looking over there. Maybe it has to do with like real estate development or whatnot, but for whatever reason you could feel that there were a lot of eyes on Queens, and that was probably going to be the next cool spot. But this also has a little bit of like, let's preserve some of the diversity there and some of the nuances of Queens by proxy, right? It's tough. We're not in a sort of proper Queens neighborhood, we're in a park, but I think it has sort of at least the halo of this is what makes Queens special, and also make New York City special. And I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, no, you did. That was perfect. I mean, Mafuzo and I talk about this all the time. Like, it's really cool to see Queens, like, in all these new TV shows, and you see, like, all these people wanting to move to Queens, but at the same time being from Queens, like, we're kind of nervous. Because we're like, is, like, the kind of the diversity, the fact that it is welcoming to low income, like, working class people, the fact that it is immigrant friendly is also being threatened. And so it's like that tension of knowing that we have 800 languages spoken here and it's super hip to live here, but also that might kind of be destructive to what exists.
Yeah, no, it's I just went to Astoria for the first time in a couple months.
That's where I'm from.
Is that? And I was completely shocked. Like, I barely recognized. I mean, obviously the sort of the structures I sort of recognized, but I was like, I think I had brunch there last week, and I was
the problem.
I'm fine. Like, I'm not sure. Like, these are processes that scholars will talk about for decades, and whether you can stop it or like stem it or not. Like, that's all something really academic, and how do you? But it is sort of jarring to see it. Like, I'm also kind of nervous, and I am also nervous in the same way. Like, night market is cool and embraced by Queens, but it's also like pretty like popular in a way that like people talk about it from Manhattan, people talk about it from Brooklyn, so it's not like I mean, I don't know if it ever did, but at the beginning people had the sense of it's like our secret, it's our little secret, Queens thing, but all of a sudden it's we New York Times #1, New York Magazine #1, it's all now travel books everywhere, and so it's a little, and then like our book coming out maybe changed that too, so it's a little bit tricky, and I it's all, but who am I to speculate on these broader forces and where they take things. So, but
I also feel like it definitely, like, having the Queens vendors on gave you that Queens credential. Like having us, we kind of just like I'm sure it shifted to the what Queen, like I guess, like in terms of like it's a platform, so like social media. Like you have that platform, whoever is joining that platform changes what that platform is, right?
Yeah.
So it became more Queens. That's I don't know if I feel like other markets are more like, okay, this is what we have, rather than, and Queens Armor is more like the vendors kind of just have mutated this situation into what it is.
And there's also the benefit, like I think the number of vendors, as I said, like maybe 10% of them work in the food industry, and maybe 10% have restaurants, and the rest have like never touched the thing, which is a cool thing, right? Like, and I mean, it's funny watching first time vendors to the very first event. It's like shocking and scary, and like, oh my god, you forgot your sign and your cash register and your food. Like, they learn really fast, but I mean, it's it has, but it has this cool effect of like feeling grassroots and community oriented, because it's not like you're not going to see this guy at every food hall. You're not going to see him, you know, at every time there's a new pop up. There's the same, you know, 6 vendors. I mean, we do have a few that are make the rounds, but in general, you know, if you don't see them there on Saturday, you won't ever see them, you know, again, for the most part, you know. So, it's true.
I mean, I was gonna ask. Do you want to ask the question?
No, I was just gonna talk about go back to the Queen. Any like cool Queen stories that came out of like being here, or Queen's vendors, Queen's moments.
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm not even sure. Some of them are like public.
This is your coolest Queen's
No. Are you talking about me or for my vendors?
Oh, whatever. Yeah. For you,
For me, my favorite Queen's experience. Not really. I mean, I think I have like a low profile. Like myself, like I think I have a low profile. It's not like I walk down the street and like I think one person in the entire like 6 years would be like, oh, do you happen to run the Queen's Night Market? Or maybe two. Like it happens sometimes at the night market. But like but it's not, you know, there's no like celebrity status here at all. But people have heard about the night market, right? And like when people like often when I go out with someone, like I usually don't tell people what I do, but when I go out with someone, they're like, oh, this guy runs the Queen's Night Market. They're like, oh my god, my family and I go there every single night and like every single Saturday. And that's and it's sort of the number of families that sort of, I don't want to call it depend on it, but use it as their sort of family time every Saturday. Like I recognize, you know, thousands of these visitors every Saturday because I see them, and that's sort of cool. That part of like integrating into people's lives is great, right? And so like I think some of the other events, like these street fairs and, you know, maybe some of our competitors, people go once a year and they like, you know, eat as much as they can, spend a ton of money and then go home. And like, you know, we went there this year. Whereas the night market itself seems like it's a lot of repeat customers. It's a lot of, you know, people that just enjoy it and like treat it as if it's part of it, like has been integrated in their life. And I think those are the kinds of moments that, you know, I don't know, they're specifically Queens. I mean, most of the people that come all the time are from Queens just because it's they're there. But I think that's sort of like, that Queens has embraced it. And if you would see the backlash from the year of planning and like the first night, and then the first night of the second year was much worse. But so like to have had my guard up for like a year and a half or 2 years about like trying to protect this idea and like telling people it's not going to be bad, you know, it's not like going to turn your neighborhood into a, you know, tourist destination, and to like finally get to the like place where like everyone just loves it and talks about it, and they're like, you know, and that's been like like one of the few like rewarding spots of like the last 6 years has been like, you know, and I always, and so I always tell people like the time that it makes that I sort of most of the time it's like I'm a mess, I'm like super stressed out, and you know, thinking from like Sunday through Friday, it's just like what has to happen for Saturday at work. And but on Saturdays when the weather's nice and, you know, the amount of people just smiling and having fun there is sort of this, you know, probably the like emotional satisfaction and the reward from all of this is just that, you know, we're making, it seems like, you know, I've seen a handful of unhappy faces at the night market, like in the last 5 years, like the five years. And so the fact that, you know, you're touching in like sort of superficial, but, you know, I don't want to say it changes anyone's lives, like it's changed some people's lives, but, you know, the fact that you're touching 25,000 lives on a Saturday night and everyone's with a smile, right? It's pretty incredible. So those are sort of my moments. It's sort of all wrapped up in like that kind of like general sense of like, I'm glad this is here.
I mean, and it's like so powerful because in the hustle and bustle of the city where everyone's really trying to, especially for families, everyone's trying to really figure out how to survive, and you're creating the space for people to connect and thrive and like to try out new ideas and be entrepreneurial. Sounds really beautiful.
And there's also, you know, I know we talk a lot about the business side, and maybe it's because we're all sort of, I guess, business oriented, but, you know, there's the satisfaction of people trying things, like asking questions from vendors, like, what is this? You know, tell me about this. And, you know, why have I never heard of it? Why don't you see this in New York City? What does this mean to you? So there's sort of like cultural exchange or sort of social exchange between pretty diverse people, right? It's also, I mean, that was sort of the point of the entire thing. And, so yeah, I mean, I think it's great that I'm pretty confident in saying we're like the most diversely attended event, but also like happily diversely attended, right? Like people are exchanging ideas and tables, and, you know, I think it's great. So.
I love that. Well, thank you so much.
Sure.
And we really appreciate you sharing your story, and also your work with the Queens Night Market. It sounds incredible.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's anything else you want to add.
Any things in the future that we should look out for?
Well, if you want to see
book, right?
Yeah, if you want to see Mafuzel in print, he'll be part. He's part.
Nice.
Yeah, he's our book is called The World Eats Here, written myself and my wife Storm, who collected stories from something like close to 50 of our vendors. We have recipes contributed from the ones that are in the book. It's called The World Eats Here. It goes to print in actually like 2 or 3 days, so we're all really nervous, and then it'll be available for purchase right when the night market opens this year in April. So
congrats! That's such a big deal.
We'll see how it goes. Yeah, I think I'm very nervous about it. Once we finally hit send, and I'll feel much better. But
it sounds like the perfect coffee table book.
I hope so. Yeah, and it's great, and I can show you guys once we get off the air. We have a hard copy for review purposes.
Nice.
Yeah, no, it's good, and the stories are really made. It's sad that we have, I think, a few hundred words per vendor because some of Storm's interviews went 4 or 5 hours long. Oh, wow. So there's some like pretty intense stuff, and you could have written a book about each of them, right? So, which is pretty cool. And there's some definitely some sob stories and some funny stories, and so it's great. I hope it's great.
I'm sure it will be. And I'm excited that we get a sneak peek.
Awesome.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time, and we look forward to reading your book when it comes out.
Great.